Take her or leave her. Either way, she's not my problem anymore." The words cracked across the auction yard like a whip, and the man who shouted them never looked back. 19-year-old Lillian Brooks stood frozen beside an empty corral, clutching a canvas bag that held everything she still owned in this world. Her own uncle had just sold her father's horses, pocketed the coin, and walked away from her as though she were a fence post. The crowd thinned, the wagons rolled out, and not one soul stopped to ask if she had anywhere to go. If you're watching this, please subscribe and follow Lillian's story all the way to the end, and comment the name of the city you're watching from, so I can see just how far her story has traveled. Take her or leave her either way, she's not my problem anymore. Harlan Brooks said it twice the second time, louder than the first, as if repetition could turn cruelty into common sense. He stuffed the auctioneer's payment into his coat and never once met his niece's eyes. Lillian didn't move. She had learned in the 6 months since her father died that some blows landed harder when you stayed still and let them pass through you. "Uncle Harlan." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Those were Papa's horses, Bishop and Clementine. He raised them from foals. You told me you'd keep them in the family. They are in the family." Harlan tugged his hat lower. "My family. Your Papa's dead, girl. Whatever he had, he left buried in debt, and I'm not feeding a grown woman who can't pull her own weight." "I pull my weight better than any man you ever hired." "Then go pull it somewhere else." His wife Edith hovered behind him, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief that had never once held a tear. "We tried, Lillian. Lord knows we tried with you. But a girl your age, unmarried, with no prospects and no money, you're a burden any way you look at it." "I'm your brother's daughter." "Half-brother." Harlan corrected her, as if the fraction made all the difference. "And he's gone now." A wagon creaked to life behind them. Edith climbed up first, settling her skirts. Harlan followed, taking the reins. Lillian stood there, expecting what? An apology, a change of heart, a single backward glance that might prove the last decade of family meals and shared winters had meant something. She got none of it. "Where am I supposed to sleep tonight?" she called after them. Harlan flicked the reins. "Reckon that's between you and the good Lord." The wagon rolled away, kicking up dust that hung in the late afternoon light, and Lillian watched it shrink down the road until the two people who were supposed to be her last family in the world became nothing more than a smudge on the horizon. She did not cry. She told herself she would not give them that, even though they couldn't see her, even though there was no one left to perform her dignity for. Around her, the great frontier auction was dying down to its bones. Men counted coins. Boys led purchased horses toward unfamiliar barns. A heavy-set auctioneer tallied his book and signaled to his assistant to start breaking down the platform. Every face in that yard belonged to someone with a destination. Every face but hers. She found a spot beside the empty corral where her father's mare had stood that morning. Clementine, 15 years old, who had let 3-year-old Lillian sit on her back before Lillian could even walk steady. Sold now. Gone to a wheat farmer who'd paid $11 and called her old. Lillian lowered herself onto an overturned feed bucket and set her canvas bag between her feet. Inside it, 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, her father's pocket knife, a daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day, and $4 she'd hidden so well that Harlan never found them. $4, a 19-year-old's entire fortune. "You all right, miss?" She looked up. An old man, bow-legged and gray, leaned on a rake. "I'm fine," she said. "You been sitting there a spell. I'm waiting on someone." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but the old man had the grace not to press. He nodded slowly the way men do when they recognize a kind of trouble they can't fix, and shuffled off toward the gate. The sun dropped lower. The platform came down board by board. The auctioneer left. The boys left. The heavy-set man left, and then his assistant, and then the old man with the rake locked the main gate from the outside and trudged toward town without realizing, or without admitting, that he'd left a living girl penned inside an empty livestock yard. And then Lillian Brooks was alone. Truly alone for the first time in her life, in a way that went past loneliness and straight into something colder. She pressed her palms against her knees and breathed and tried to make a plan because making a plan was what her father had taught her to do when the world fell apart. Think it through, Lily girl. Panic never broke a horse, and it never solved a problem. All right, Papa. She could climb the fence. She could walk to town. She could find what an inn cost money she couldn't spare. A church might take her in for a night, but then what tomorrow? She'd still be a girl with no family, no home, no horse, and $4 between herself and ruin. She'd heard what happened to girls who ran out of money and ran out of people. She'd heard it in whispers from women who pretended they hadn't. There were houses in every territory town that would take a desperate, pretty, friendless girl and give her a roof in exchange for the only thing she had left to sell. No, she said aloud to the empty yard to no one. No, I'd rather starve. But starving, she was learning, did not feel like a brave choice when your stomach had been empty since dawn. She didn't hear the footsteps until they were close. They locked you in. Lillian came off the bucket fast, her hand dropping to her bag where her father's knife sat folded. A man stood on the other side of the corral fence, tall, broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his 30s, with a weathered face that the dimming light made hard to read. His coat was good wool, well made, but worn at the cuffs from real use, not display. A man who had money but hadn't forgotten how to work. I can let myself out, she said. I was about to. I don't doubt it. He didn't move closer. He seemed to understand the way the old man with the rake had understood that a cornered creature needs room. I watched the whole thing, from across the yard. Heat climbed Lillian's neck. So he'd seen it. Seen her uncle sell her father's horses and abandon her like spoiled goods. Seen her become the thing no one would buy and no one would claim. Then you've had your show, she said. You can go on home now. I'm Nathaniel Hayes. The name meant nothing to her, and her face said so. I run Red Willow, he added. When that didn't land either, the corner of his mouth moved not quite a smile. Cattle outfit, North Valley. Most folks around here know it. I'm not from around here. My father's ranch was 3 days east. Was. She lifted her chin. I'm Lillian Brooks, and I don't take charity, Mr. Hayes, if that's what brought you over. Didn't figure you did. You don't strike me as the charity-taking kind. Then what do you want? It was a fair question, and a sharp one, and Nathaniel Hayes considered it longer than she expected. Most men she'd found answered fast because they'd already decided what they wanted before they ever opened their mouths. This one seemed to be deciding right there in front of her. I've got 40 horses on my place, he said finally, and 3 of them won't let a single hand near 'em. Spooked, mean, or both. My foreman wants to sell 'em for what they'll bring, which isn't much, and I watched you an hour back when they brought that gray stallion through, the one that near took a man's arm off. Lillian remembered. The gray had reared and screamed and lashed out at every rope, and 3 grown men had cursed and yanked and made it worse, and she'd been unable to stop herself. She'd stepped to the fence and made a low sound in her throat, the sound her father used, and the gray had swung its great head toward her and gone still. He calmed for you, Nathaniel said. Just for a second, but he calmed. He was scared, not mean. There's a difference. Those men couldn't tell it. No, they couldn't. He rested a forearm on the top rail. But you could. From clear across a yard you could. The silence stretched. Somewhere past the gate a dog barked and went quiet. I'm not asking you to take charity, Nathaniel said. I'm offering you work. Honest work for honest wage, same as I'd offer any hand. You'd have a room in the house my aunt keeps it. You'd not be alone with men. You'd have meals. You'd have a door that locks from the inside. He paused. And if it doesn't suit you, you leave and I drive you to town myself, no questions, no debt. That's the whole of it. Lillian's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. Everything in her father's teaching told her to be careful. A strange man, a locked yard, dusk falling, an offer too good to be real. Why? She asked. You don't know me. I could be a thief. I could be lying about everything. You could be? He nodded as though she'd made a reasonable point. But I watched a man sell your daddy's horses and leave you sitting in the dirt, and not one person in that crowd lifted a finger. 40 people, Miss Brooks, I counted, and I stood there counting and feeling like a coward, same as the rest. His jaw tightened. No decent soul should get abandoned twice in one day. Once was the world's doing. Twice it'd be mine, and I'd have to live with that. She stared at him. That's the why, he said. It's not pretty and it's not noble. I just don't want to be the 41st person who walked away from you. For a long moment, Lillian Brooks said nothing, because the truth was that no one had spoken to her like a person worth not abandoning in 6 long months, and the kindness of it threatened to undo the composure she'd fought so hard to keep. I don't do charity, she said again, but the fight had gone soft in it. It's not charity if you break my 3 horses. A real smile, this time brief and tired. Then I'm getting the better end of the deal. Foreman wants to sell 'em for $40 total. They're worth $400 each sound. You do the math, Miss Brooks. I'm not being kind. I'm being smart. It was a gift wrapped up to look like a transaction, so that she could accept it without surrendering her pride, and she understood exactly what he was doing. And she understood that he knew she understood, and somehow that made it possible. Come home with me, he said. Quiet, plain. Not a command, and not a plea. You can decide everything else in the morning. The light was nearly gone now. Lillian looked down at her canvas bag at $4 and a Bible and a dead man's pocket knife. She looked at the empty corral where her childhood mare had stood that morning. She looked at the locked gate that the world had shut on her. And then she picked up her bag. If your aunt looks at me sideways even once, she said, climbing over the fence rather than waiting for him to open the gate. I'm gone by dawn, I mean that. I'd expect nothing less. He offered a hand to steady her descent. She didn't take it. He let the hand fall without comment, and somehow that the not insisting told her more about him than anything he'd said. His wagon waited beyond the gate, a sturdy buckboard with a patient bay gelding in the traces. Lillian set her bag in the back and climbed up onto the seat, leaving a careful foot of space between them. How far? She asked. 2 hours, give or take. You can sleep if you want. I won't take it wrong. I don't sleep around strangers. Smart girl. They rode out into the falling dark, and for the first while neither of them spoke. Lillian kept her hand near her bag and her eyes on the road and her body half turned so she could watch him sidelong. He drove easy, both hands loose on the reins, in no hurry, asking her nothing. It was the not asking that finally got to her. You're not curious, she said. About what happened. My father, the debt, why my family. The word caught. Why they did what they did. Figured you'd tell me if you wanted to, and if you didn't, that'd be your business. Most people want the whole story before they'll spend a dime on you. I'm not most people. He clucked to the gelding around a rut in the road. And I already spent the dime. She almost smiled. Almost. My father was a good man, she heard herself say, and she had not planned to say it, but the dark made confession easier, and the 2-hour ride stretched ahead of them with nothing to fill it. Caleb Brooks. He had a gift with horses, the kind you can't learn, the kind you're just born with, or you're not. People came from 2 counties over to have him gentle their stock. He never broke a horse the hard way. Said breaking was a fool's word for it, that you don't break a creature, you teach it to trust you. He sounds like a man worth knowing. He was. Her throat tightened. He caught a fever last winter. The doctor came too late, and there was nothing. It took him in 9 days. 9 days, and then he was just gone, and the bank held papers I didn't know about, debts he'd taken on, to keep us afloat after the bad year. And his half-brother Harlan showed up before Papa was even cold in the ground, with a lawyer saying as the only living male relation he was entitled to the estate. Nathaniel's hands tightened on the reins, but he said nothing. There wasn't much estate. Lillian went on, because she couldn't seem to stop now. After the debts, there was the land which the bank took, and the horses, and the house, and what was in it. Harlan said he'd take care of me. Said I'd live with him and his wife and earn my keep. And I did. For 6 months I cooked and cleaned and tended their stock and never asked for a thing. Her voice went flat and cold. And then this morning, He loaded up Papa's last 2 horses to sell at auction and told me to come along and help. And I thought maybe afterward we'd ride home. And instead he sold them, and he sold the wagon, and he counted his money, and he told me I wasn't his problem anymore. The wagon rolled on through the dark. He waited 6 months, she said mostly to herself. Long enough to wring 6 months of free labor out of me. Long enough to sell everything that was Papa's. And then he didn't need me. A bitter sound escaped her. I keep trying to find the cruelty in it, and the worst part is there isn't any. He didn't hate me. I just wasn't worth feeding. For a long moment, Nathaniel Hayes drove in silence. When he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough. My father died when I was 19 too, he said. Same age as you are now. Heart gave out in the saddle. He built Red Willow up from 1/4 section and 100 head. And the day we buried him, 3 of his oldest friends came to the house and offered to buy me out. Cheap. Said a boy couldn't run an outfit that size. His jaw worked. Said it standing in my own parlor with the funeral flowers still on the table. What did you do? Told him no. Then I went out to the barn and was sick because I had no earthly idea how to keep my word. He almost laughed. Took me 10 years and more mistakes than I can count. But I learned what I learned, and I learned it the way you only can when there's no one left to catch you if you fall. He glanced at her just once. That's why I didn't walk away from you back there. I know what it is to be 19 and standing in the wreckage of your whole life, with every grown-up who was supposed to protect you, suddenly looking at you like a problem to be solved. Lillian turned her face away, so he wouldn't see what his words had done to it. I'm still not taking charity, she managed. Good, he said gently. Because I haven't offered you any. I've offered you 3 of the meanest horses in the territory and a wage you'll earn twice over. Don't go softening it into kindness now. You'll insult us both. And against everything. Against 6 months of grief and a day of abandonment and a lifetime of her father's warnings about strangers. Lillian Brooks felt the corner of her mouth lift, and this time she let it. Red Willow Ranch announced itself before they reached it. First the lanterns, a scatter of warm gold lights against the black hills, then the long, low shape of bunkhouses and barns, and finally the main house itself. 2 stories of solid timber, with a porch that ran the whole front length, and a single window still glowing upstairs at this late hour. Somebody's awake, Lillian said. My aunt, Margaret. Nathaniel drew the wagon up before the porch. She'll have heard the wheels. She hears everything. He set the brake. Miss Brooks, before we go in, she's going to look you over, and she's going to ask you questions, and she's going to seem hard. She is hard. But she's fair, and she runs that house like a Bible camp, and there's not a soul on this place she hasn't looked after at one time or another, myself included. Don't mistake her sharpness for unkindness. It's the same mistake folks make about me. The front door opened before Lillian could answer. The woman who stepped out onto the porch was perhaps 60, straight-backed, gray-haired, with a lamp in one hand, and a shawl thrown over her nightgown. She had a face that had clearly spent a lifetime refusing to suffer foolishness, and she lifted the lamp now to throw light over the 2 figures climbing down from the wagon. Nathaniel Hayes, she said in the tone of a woman who had used that full name to good effect for 36 years. It's near midnight. Who is this? Aunt Margaret, this is Miss Lillian Brooks. She'll be working with the horses. She'll need the back bedroom. Will she? Margaret Hayes raised the lamp higher and studied Lillian without apology, head to foot and back again. Lillian made herself stand straight and meet the old woman's eyes and not flinch. And where did you find Miss Lillian Brooks at this hour? Auction yard in Caldwell. At the auction. Margaret's gaze flicked to the canvas bag, to the road, dust, to the careful blankness Lillian had pulled over her own face. The old woman missed nothing. Sit her down at the kitchen table, Nathaniel, before she falls down. The child's gray as ash. When did you last eat, girl? The question came so suddenly, so plainly, that Lillian's careful composure cracked right down the middle. This morning, she said. Early. Something moved behind Margaret Hayes's hard eyes. This morning. Early. She turned and pushed the door wide. "Inside. Both of you. There's stew on the back of the stove and bread under the cloth, and I'll not hear a word of argument from anyone about the hour." "I don't take," Lillian began. "You don't take charity?" "Yes, I can see it stamped on you like a brand." Margaret fixed her with a look that was somehow both stern and not unkind. "This isn't charity, child, it's stew. Sit down and eat it before I take it as an insult. There's a difference between charity and a meal, and any woman who can't tell the two apart is too proud to be much use to anyone." It was so exactly the same logic Nathaniel had used at the auction yard that Lillian looked between the two of them, the hard old aunt and the quiet cattle baron, and understood that whatever else this strange place was, it ran on a particular kind of kindness that disguised itself as common sense, so that no proud soul would have to feel beholden. She sat down at the kitchen table. She ate the stew, and when Margaret set a second bowl in front of her without being asked, and then turned away to busy herself at the stove so that Lillian could weep into the steam without being watched. Lillian Brooks finally let herself believe just a little, just for tonight, that the world might not be done with her after all. She woke before dawn out of habit, in a narrow bed in a clean small room, with a door that locked from the inside, and for one terrible moment she didn't know where she was. Then it came back, the auction, the wagon, the stew. And she lay very still, and listened to a house that was not her uncle's house, full of unfamiliar creaks and the distant sounds of a working ranch coming awake. She dressed in her good dress because it was the only other one she owned, and she made the bed with hospital corners, and she found her way down to the kitchen where Margaret Hayes was already up and rolling out biscuit dough by lamplight. "You needn't have risen so early," Margaret said without turning around. "Breakfast not for an hour. I don't lie abed while others work." "No? I didn't suppose you did." Margaret nodded at a second rolling pin. "If you mean to be useful, the dough won't roll itself." They worked in silence for a while, two women in a warm kitchen, and it was Margaret who finally spoke. "My nephew told me what he saw yesterday, at the auction." Her hands didn't pause. "Your kin, selling your father's horses, leaving you sitting there." Lillian's own hands stilled. "He told you that. He tells me most things. He's not a talker, but he's not a man who keeps secrets from the people he trusts." Margaret set down her pen and looked at Lillian directly. "I'll say this once, child, and then we'll not speak of it again, unless you wish to. What was done to you was wicked, not unfortunate, not sad. Wicked. There's a word for kin who'll strip a girl of everything her father left her, and then turn her out to fend for herself, and that word is wicked, and I'll not have you carrying it as though the shame were yours. The shame is theirs. You hear me?" Lillian's eyes stung. "Yes, ma'am." "Good." Margaret picked up her pen again. "Now, my nephew is a good man, the best I know, but he's lonely as a fence post in January, and twice as stubborn about admitting it, and he's brought home strays before that broke his heart and emptied his pockets. So I'll tell you plainly what I told myself last night when I heard the wagon." She rolled the dough flat. "I don't yet know if you're a gift or a grief to this place, Lillian Brooks, but I mean to find out. And if you're what I hope you are, you'll find no truer friend in this territory than me. And if you're what I fear you are," the old eyes flashed, "you'll find no fiercer enemy. Are we understood?" "We're understood," Lillian said. "And ma'am, I'd want it no other way. I don't trust kindness that comes too easy. I never have." For the first time, something like approval crossed Margaret Hayes's weathered face. "No," she said quietly. "I don't suppose you do. The cheaply bought kind cost you everything, didn't it?" She turned back to her dough. "Eat your breakfast when the men come in. Then go find my nephew at the Round Corral. He'll want to show you those 3 demon horses he thinks you can save. Lord help us all." The 3 horses were worse than Nathaniel had let on. The first, a black mare, had been beaten by a previous owner and now exploded into violence at the mere raising of a hand. The second, a young sorrel gelding, was so consumed by fear that he'd run himself bloody against the corral rails rather than let a man approach. And the third? The third was the gray stallion from the auction. "Bought him yesterday." Nathaniel said, leaning on the corral rail while Lillian studied the animal. After I saw what you did, Foreman thinks I've lost my mind. Maybe I have. Paid good money for a horse can't nobody touch. The gray stood trembling in the center of the round pen, ears pinned, eyes rolling white, sweating despite the cool morning. 3 ranch hands stood well back, ropes in hand, and every one of them looked relieved to have an excuse not to go in. What's his story? Lillian asked. Don't rightly know all of it. Came up from a Texas outfit. Word is, a man tried to break him the hard way, tied him down, beat him the whole ugly business, then gave up and passed him on. He's been sold 4 times in 2 years. Nobody can do a thing with him. 4 times, Lillian repeated softly. She was looking at the stallion's eyes. Sold and passed along because he was too much trouble to keep. Something in her chest pulled tight. He's not mean, Mr. Hayes. He's been hurt by every single person who ever got close to him, and now he's decided it's safer to hurt them first. Can't say I blame him. She set her hand on the gate. Miss Brooks. Nathaniel straightened off the rail, sudden tension in his voice. He near killed a man last week. I won't have you going in there alone. Take a hand with you, or a rope at least. A rope's the last thing he wants to see. Lillian unlatched the gate. And another person in there is just one more thing for him to be scared of. I go in alone or I don't go in at all. Lillian! It was the first time he'd used her given name. Mr. Hayes. She turned and met his eyes, and her own were steady. You bought this horse on a notion that I could help him, so either you trust that notion or you don't. Which is it? The hands had gone quiet. Margaret had appeared at the edge of the yard watching. Nathaniel Hayes looked at the trembling killer of a horse, and then at the slip of a girl who meant to walk in alone to face it. And Lillian watched him war with himself, watched every protective instinct he had strain against the promise he'd made not to be one more person who decided for her. If he charges you, he said finally low, you drop and roll for the rails. You don't try to stare him down. You hear me? I hear you. I mean it, Lillian. I know you do. And something in her voice gentled just slightly because she understood that his fear was not for his investment. I'll be careful. I promise you that. She slipped into the pen and latched the gate behind her. The gray stallion exploded. He reared screaming forelegs, slashing the air, and every hand in the yard shouted. And the sorrel in the next pen panicked at the noise, and Lillian Brooks did not run, did not raise her hands, did not even look directly at the great beast bearing down on her. She turned her body sideways, dropped her eyes, and went absolutely still, and made the sound. The low sound deep in her throat, the sound her father had made 1,000 times, the sound that said in a language older than words, I am no threat. I am not the ones who hurt you. I am only here. The stallion came down. Hooves struck the dirt feet from her. He stood there heaving, lathered, ready to kill, and Lillian did not move, and did not look at him, and did not stop making that low, patient, endless sound, the sound of a girl who knew exactly what it was to be hurt by everyone who came close, and decided it was safer to strike first. I know, she murmured, so quiet that only the horse could hear. I know. They hurt you, and they sold you, and they hurt you again, and you've decided not to let anybody close ever again, because close is where the pain comes from. Her throat worked. I know about that. I do. They abandoned me at an auction yesterday, same as somebody once tied you down and beat you. We're a pair, you and me. The stallion's ears flicked, one then both swiveling toward her voice. I'm not going to touch you, she said. Not today. I'm not going to put a rope on you, or climb on your back, or any of the things the others did. I'm just going to stand here. And tomorrow I'll come and stand here again, and the day after that. And one day, not today, not for a long while. Yet you're going to decide all on your own, that maybe I'm not like the rest. She stood in the center of that pen for an hour. She never touched the horse. She never tried. And by the end of it, the gray stallion had lowered his head, and his trembling had eased, and when at last she turned to walk out, slow, sideways, eyes down the great wild animal that had nearly killed a man, took 3 hesitant steps, and followed her to the gate. The yard had gone dead silent. Lillian latched the gate behind her, and only then realized her hands were shaking. She looked up to find every hand on the ranch staring at her, and Margaret Hayes with one hand pressed to her chest, and Nathaniel Hayes looking at her as though he had never in his life seen anything like her, as though the ground had shifted somewhere beneath his feet, and he had only just felt it move. "He followed you," Nathaniel said. "He's not broken," Lillian said quietly, watching the gray. "He's just scared. There's a difference. I told you that yesterday." "You did." Nathaniel's voice had gone strange and rough. "I'm beginning to think I'd best start listening when you tell me things." Margaret Hayes crossed the yard and took Lillian's still trembling hands in both of her own and looked into the girl's face with eyes that had gone bright and wet. "A gift," the old woman said softly to herself, to Lillian, to whatever power had set a wagon on that road at dusk. "Not a grief, a gift." Her grip tightened. "Welcome to Red Willow, child. Welcome home." And Lillian Brooks, 19 years old, orphaned, abandoned, sold out by her own blood, and left in the dirt of an auction yard, not 24 hours before, stood in the center of a strange ranch, surrounded by strangers, and felt for the first time since her father died the dangerous, fragile, terrifying beginning of something she had stopped letting herself believe in. She felt the beginning of hope. What none of them knew, not Lillian, not Margaret, not Nathaniel standing there looking at her like the world had changed shape, was that 200 miles to the south in a paneled office in a Cattlemen's Association building, 3 men in good suits were already bent over a map of the North Valley, and one of them had drawn a thick black circle around Red Willow Ranch, and one of them had said in the easy voice of a man who always got what he wanted, "Hayes won't sell, so we'll have to give him a reason to." But that was 200 miles away, and it was still morning, and the gray stallion had followed a girl to the gate. For now, that was enough. The gray stallion let her touch him on the 11th day. Lillian had counted them. 10 mornings of standing in that pen, making the low sound, while the great animal trembled and watched her. 10 mornings of leaving without ever once raising her hand to him. And on the 11th morning, she turned to go and felt warm breath against the back of her neck. She went still. She did not reach for him. She let him decide. The stallion pressed his muzzle against her shoulder just for a moment, soft as a question, and then jerked back as though frightened of his own daring. "There," Lillian whispered, not turning, her own eyes burning. "There. That wasn't so terrible, was it?" Across the yard, Nathaniel Hayes set down the coffee he'd been pretending to drink for the better part of an hour. He'd come out to the corral every single morning of those 11 days. He told himself it was to make sure the girl didn't get killed. He'd stopped believing his own excuse around day 4. "Don't say a word," Lillian called to him without looking. "You'll spook him. He's still deciding whether to be brave." "Wasn't going to say a word." But Nathaniel was smiling, and the 2 hands beside him were grinning outright because the gray stallion that had nearly killed a man 3 weeks ago had just nuzzled a slip of a girl like a foal nosing its mother. That was the thing about Lillian Brooks Nathaniel was learning. She didn't break horses, and she didn't break people. She just outlasted their fear. She would not be idle. That was the second thing the ranch learned about her, and they learned it fast. The morning after the stallion let her touch him, the foreman, a square-built man named Cole Pruitt, who'd worked Red Willow 18 years, and had not been consulted about hiring any auction yard girl, found Lillian in the tack room before sunup with her sleeves rolled to the elbow. "What in the world are you doing to those saddles?" he said. "Half your tack's dry rotting." She didn't stop working the oil into the leather. "These cinches are one hard pull from snapping. Somebody could get killed." "That's the hands' job to keep up." "Then the hands have been letting it slide because 3 of these latigos are cracked clean through." She held one up. "You want to tell Mr. Hayes a man broke his neck because nobody oiled a strap, or you want me to fix them this morning while it's quiet?" Cole Pruitt opened his mouth to put the girl in her place. Then he took the cracked latigo from her hand, turned it over, and saw that she was right. "Fix 'em," he said gruffly, and walked out. And that was the end of his quarrel with Lillian Brooks, though it took him another month to admit it. She mended the tack. She reorganized the feed records, which had been kept in a water-stained ledger so chaotic that no one could say with certainty how much grain remained, and within a week she'd discovered they were being shorted by a feed supplier in town who'd been padding his weights for 2 years. 2 years, Nathaniel said, staring at her neat new columns of figures spread across the kitchen table. You're telling me Dutton's been stealing from me for 2 years? $11 a month, give or take. It adds up. Lillian tapped the page. He counts on nobody keeping straight records. Most ranches don't. My father did. He used to say the man who doesn't watch his pennies has no business complaining about his dollars. Margaret Hayes, kneading bread at the counter, made a sound of grim satisfaction. I always did say there was something oily about that Dutton. You said no such thing, Nathaniel said. I thought it, loudly. Margaret pointed a floury finger at the ledger. That girl just saved you near $300 and caught a thief, and you're sitting there with your mouth open. Say thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you, Lillian. You're paying me to be useful, Lillian said, but color had risen in her cheeks and she busied herself with the figures so she wouldn't have to look at either of them. She still did not know what to do with gratitude. It sat strange on her, like a coat cut for somebody else. She found 100 small ways to make herself necessary. She noticed which of the hands favored a sore knee in the cold and quietly rearranged the heavy lifting so it didn't fall to him. She caught the youngest stable boy, a 14-year-old named Tobias, whose folks were dead and who slept in the loft crying behind the barn over a letter he couldn't read, and she read it to him. It was from a sister he'd thought lost, sent on by 3 different addresses, and then she taught him his letters in the evenings, so he'd never be at the mercy of another man's reading again. She mended the aging hand's torn blankets at night, sitting up by the lamp after the house had gone quiet, and never said a word about it, and let them think the mending fairy had visited until old Wesley, with the bad hip, caught her at it one midnight and stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and his eyes wet and said, Miss Lillian, you don't have to do that for an old wreck like me. And she said, I know I don't. That's why I want to. She did not do it to be loved. That was what made them love her. She did it because she had been the person nobody helped sitting alone in an empty auction yard, while 40 people walked away, and she had sworn in that moment. Though she'd told no one that wherever she landed, she would never let another soul feel that particular kind of alone if she could help it. Red Willow had been a business when she arrived. By the end of her 2nd month, it was becoming a family, and the hands who'd grumbled about the auction girl now competed to sit near her at supper. Nathaniel watched it happen, and did not entirely understand it, and could not look away from it. You're different, Margaret said to him one evening. They were on the porch. Lillian was down at the corral with the gray in the last of the light, and Nathaniel had been watching her for some while without quite admitting he was watching her. Different how? Don't play the fool with me, Nathaniel Hayes. I changed your diapers. Margaret rocked slowly in her chair. You've smiled more in 2 months than in the 2 years before her. You linger at supper. You found a reason to be at that corral every morning for 11 straight days, and don't tell me it was about the horse. It was about the horse. It was never about the horse. Nathaniel was quiet a long moment, watching the small, distant figure of the girl, murmuring to the stallion in the dusk. She doesn't want anything from me, he said finally, and it came out lower and more honest than he'd intended. You know how many women have come through that door in 10 years, Aunt Margaret daughters paraded by ambitious fathers. Widows who suddenly found me fascinating once they learned the size of the place. Every one of them, I could see it in their eyes, they were doing sums, adding up the acres, pricing the cattle. And Lillian doesn't even see the acres. He shook his head slowly. I told her once offhand that we run near 4,000 head. You know what she said? She asked whether we had enough hands to check them all for screwworm in the wet season. She wasn't impressed. She was worried about the cattle. A short, baffled laugh. I've never in my life met a person who looked at everything I built and saw the work in it instead of the money. That's because she's not for sale, Margaret said quietly. She's the only person who's walked through that door in 10 years that nobody could buy, including the family that tried to sell her. She reached over and patted his hand. You be careful with her, Nathaniel. That girl's been thrown away by everyone who was ever supposed to keep her. If you mean to matter to her, you'd best be certain you'll never be the next one to let go, because she's bracing for it. Every kind thing you do, some part of her is waiting for the bill to come due." Nathaniel said nothing, but he understood that his aunt had named the very thing he'd been circling for weeks without the courage to look at directly. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday, and it came in a good suit. Lillian was in the corral when the buggy rolled up the long road to the house, a fine black buggy, too fine for ranch country, pulled by a matched pair that no working outfit would ever waste money on. A man climbed down. City clothes. A flat-brimmed hat that had never seen rain. He smiled up at the house in a way that made the hair rise on the back of Lillian's neck before she'd heard a single word he said. She didn't know why. She just knew the look. She'd seen it on the lawyer Harlan brought to her father's funeral. It was the look of a man who'd already decided what he was going to take. "Mr. Hayes." The man's voice carried warm and easy as Nathaniel came out onto the porch. "Nathaniel Hayes. It's an honor, sir. A genuine honor. Silas Thornton, Western Territories Development Company. I wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes of your valuable time." "I know who you are, Thornton." Nathaniel did not come down the steps, and his voice had gone flat in a way Lillian had never heard from him. "You've been buying up the small outfits north of here, the Caldwells, the Mercer place, Old Man Pratt's quarter sections. Buying, yes, at fair prices, generous prices, I'd say." Thornton spread his hands, the picture of reason. "Times are hard, Mr. Hayes. This drought's breaking the small men. I'm offering them a way out before the bank takes everything for nothing. I'd think a man of your standing would call that a mercy." "I'd call it vultures circling," Nathaniel said. "What do you want with me, Thornton? My place isn't small and I'm not breaking." Thornton's smile didn't waver, but something behind it sharpened, and Lillian, watching from the corral, felt her stomach tighten. "Mr. Hayes, I'll speak plainly because I respect you. My company is assembling the entire North Valley. Rail's coming through, you know it's coming, everyone knows it's coming, and the valley's the natural route. The man who controls that water and that grade is going to be very, very rich." He paused. "Red Willow sits square in the middle of it. I'm prepared to offer you a figure that would let you buy 3 ranches twice this size in better country. I'm prepared to make you a wealthy man for the rest of your days." "I'm already wealthy," Nathaniel said. "And this is my home. It was my father's home. My answer's no." "You haven't heard the figure." "I don't need to. There's no figure for home, Thornton. You wouldn't understand that, which is exactly why I'd never sell to you." For a long moment, Silas Thornton stood very still, and the warmth drained out of his face like water out of a cracked basin, and what was left underneath was cold and patient and certain. "That's a shame, Mr. Hayes," he said softly, "because the valley's going to be assembled, with you or without you, and the men who hold out—" He let it hang. "Well, they tend to find that holding out gets expensive. The Caldwells held out, you know, for a while." He climbed back into his fine buggy and gathered the reins. "Their barn burned. Terrible thing. Sold the next week for half what I'd first offered. Funny how that works." "Get off my land, Thornton. I'm going." The man tipped his hat, smiling again, and the smile was worse than any threat. "Think on it, Mr. Hayes, and maybe—" His eyes drifted just once to the corral, to the girl standing very still beside the gray stallion. "Maybe think on everything you've got to lose. A man with a whole ranch to protect has a great many soft spots, doesn't he? A great many." He drove away. Nathaniel stood on the porch with his hands curled into fists, and Lillian came up from the corral, and neither of them spoke until the buggy had vanished down the road. "He looked at me," Lillian said quietly. "When he said that last part, about soft spots, he looked right at me." "I know." Nathaniel's voice was tight. "He's a snake. He's telling me he'll hurt whatever I care about until I sell. The Caldwell's barn didn't burn by accident, Lillian. I know it, and he knows I know it. What are you going to do? I'm going to protect this place, and everyone on it." He turned to her, and there was something fierce in his face, and something else underneath it, something he didn't yet have words for. Including you. He noticed you. That's a problem now. I won't pretend it isn't. I can take care of myself, Mr. Hayes. I've been doing it a while. I know you can. A muscle worked in his jaw. That's not the point. The point is you shouldn't have to. Not here. Not anymore. Lillian looked at him, and for one dangerous moment, something passed between them, unspoken and enormous. And then old Wesley called out from the barn about a foundered mare. And the moment broke, and they both pretended it hadn't happened. But that night, lying awake in her narrow bed behind her door that locked from the inside, Lillian Brooks admitted to the dark what she could not admit to anyone's face. That she had started to care whether Nathaniel Hayes lost his ranch. That somewhere in 2 months of mending blankets and gentling horses and eating Margaret's stew, this strange place had stopped being a job she'd flee at the first sideways look. It had started terrifyingly to feel like home. And the one lesson her life had taught her again and again was that the things which felt like home were exactly the things the world took away. The threats started small. A gate left open so the saddle horses scattered across 2 sections and cost a full day to gather. Then a stretch of fence cut clean the wire showing the bright bite of pliers, not the rust of weather. Then a water trough fouled with coal oil so the cattle wouldn't drink, and 3 of them sickened before anyone caught it. Could be coincidence, Cole Pruitt said, but he didn't believe it, and neither did anyone else. It's Thornton, Nathaniel said. He's testing us, seeing how much it'll take. Then we double the night watch, Cole said. Catch whoever he's sending. They doubled the watch, and for 2 weeks nothing happened, and Lillian began to hope it had been a passing thing, that maybe Thornton had found easier prey. She should have known better. She did know better. The quiet was never an ending. The quiet was only the breath a thing took before it struck. It struck before dawn on a Sunday. Lillian woke to the sound that no person raised around horses can ever sleep through the high, terrible scream of an animal in agony. She was out of bed and down the stairs in her nightgown before she was fully awake, and Margaret was already there, and they ran for the barn together and found 3 of the hands clustered around the breeding stalls with lanterns and the screaming and the smell. "Get back, Miss Lillian!" Wesley tried to stop her. "You don't want to—" She pushed past him. 4 of Red Willow's finest breeding mares lay thrashing in their stalls, lathered and convulsing eyes rolling, and 1 was already still. Lillian dropped to her knees beside the nearest and put her hands on the mare's heaving neck, and knew with the certainty that came from her father's gift that it was already too late. "Poison," she said. Her voice came out hollow. "Somebody's poisoned them. In the feed check, the feed all of it. Get the rest of the stock off it right now." She was already moving, already shouting orders, and the hands scrambled to obey, because in that moment she was the only one not frozen. "Wesley, the grain bin, dump it. Don't let another animal near it. Tobias, run for the others. Wake everyone. We have to check every horse on this place." Nathaniel arrived at a dead run half-dressed and took in the scene in one horrified sweep. "How many?" he said. 4 mares. 1's gone. The others—" Lillian's hands were shaking on the dying animal beneath her. "I can't save them, Nathaniel. Whatever it was fast and it was a lot. Somebody knew exactly what they were doing." He knelt beside her in the filth and the lantern light, and for once he had no answer. No plan. Nothing. These were his best mares. Bloodlines his father had spent 30 years building. Gone in a single night. "Strychnine most like," Lillian said quietly so only he could hear. "Mixed into their grain. Whoever did it knew which stalls held the most valuable stock. This wasn't random, Nathaniel. They walked past 40 horses to poison these 4. Thornton, or someone he sent." She looked up at him, and her face had gone hard and pale. "It's a message. He's telling you he can reach inside your own barn whenever he likes. By the time the sun came up, 3 of the 4 mares were dead, and the 4th was so far gone that Nathaniel had to do the thing no horseman ever wants to do out behind the barn where the others wouldn't have to watch. The single shot rolled across the morning quiet, and somewhere in the corrals, the gray stallion screamed an answer, and Lillian stood in the barn doorway with both hands pressed to her mouth and felt the old terror rising, the terror she'd thought she'd left in that auction yard, the terror that everything good was about to be taken from her again. The whispers started by noon. Lillian heard them the way you always hear the things people say about you sideways in fragments in the sudden silence when she entered a room. Two of the newer hands brought on that spring who didn't know her the way the old ones did. Never had trouble like this before she came. 4 months and now poison-cut fence. My granny'd call that bad luck walking. You ask me, that girl appeared out of nowhere. Auction yard. Nobody knows a thing about her people. She pretended not to hear. She'd had practice pretending. But each word found the soft place under her ribs and lodged there, because the worst part, the unbearable part, was that some small broken voice inside her agreed with them. You bring ruin. You're the thing that gets thrown away because keeping you costs too much. Your own blood knew it. They all know it eventually. She was scrubbing the poison residue from the empty feed troughs that afternoon, doing it herself on her knees because she couldn't bear to be idle with grief sitting on her chest, when she heard boots behind her and turned to find one of the new hands, a thick-necked man named Briggs, standing too close with an ugly look on his face. You did this, he said. Lillian rose slowly to her feet. I did not. 4 months of peace, then you show up and now we got poison in the barn and fence cut to ribbons and the boss bleeding money. You're bad luck, girl. Or worse than luck. Maybe you let somebody in. Maybe somebody paid you to. You watch your mouth, Briggs. Old Wesley had appeared, his bad hip be damned, putting himself between them. That girl mended your bedroll when you didn't have 2 coins to your name and read your hand his letters, and you'll not stand there and... It's all right, Wesley. Lillian's voice was steady, though her heart was slamming. He's frightened. Frightened men need somebody to blame. I understand it. She looked Briggs full in the face. But I'd cut off my own hand before I'd let harm come to a single animal on this place, and if you knew the first thing about me, you'd know that. Now get out of my way. I've got troughs to clean. She held his eyes until he looked away. But that night alone in her room, the steadiness left her all at once, and she sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and shook, because Briggs was wrong about everything except one thing. The trouble had come with her. Not because she caused it, she knew she hadn't caused it, but because Thornton wanted the ranch, and Thornton had noticed that the way to hurt Nathaniel Hayes was to hurt what he loved, and Nathaniel had stood on that porch and told the snake plain as day that he meant to protect her. She'd made Nathaniel vulnerable, just by being here, just by being something he cared about. The thought arrived cold and complete and final. Everyone who keeps you ends up paying for it. Your father gave you everything and died poor. Harlan kept you 6 months and resented every meal. And now Nathaniel's mares are dead, and his fences are cut, and a rich man with no soul has marked this whole place for ruin. And the marking started the day he saw you standing in that corral. She pressed her face into her hands. It got worse 2 days later, and it got worse in a way she never saw coming. She was crossing the yard when she heard the dogs, and then the buggy. Not Thornton's fine black rig this time, but a battered farm wagon she did not recognize. And then she saw who held the reins, and the ground seemed to drop away beneath her feet. Harlan. Her Uncle Harlan, with Edith beside him in her good Sunday bonnet, rolling up the road to Red Willow Ranch as if 4 months hadn't passed, as if he hadn't left her sitting in the dirt of an auction yard, as if any of it had never happened. For one wild instant, Lillian thought she might be sick. Lillian? Edith's voice sweet as poisoned sugar carried across the yard. Oh, Lillian, there you are. We've been so worried, child, so dreadfully worried. We came back to that awful auction, and you'd vanished, and we've searched and searched. You searched. Lillian's voice did not sound like her own. You searched for 4 months. We never stopped, dear. You sold my father's horses and told me I wasn't your problem. The words came out flat and terrible. You drove away. I watched you drive away. There was no searching Edith. Don't you dare stand on this land and lie to my face." Harlan climbed down from the wagon, and his eyes were already moving. Lillian saw them move, taking in the barns, the bunkhouses, the great two-story house, the 4,000 head of cattle. The place was famous for doing exactly the sums she'd watched a dozen ambitious women do at Nathaniel's supper table. He was pricing it. "Now, Lillian," Harlan said, in the reasonable voice he always used right before he took something from you. "Let's not have hard words in front of strangers. Family's family. We made a mistake leaving you that day. We were under terrible strain, the debts you understand. But we've come to make it right. We've come to bring you home." "This is my home." "This?" Harlan's eyes glittered. "This belongs to a man named Hayes, near as I can tell from asking in town. A rich man. A rich man who took in a homeless girl with no family to speak for her, no one to protect her." His voice oiled into something Lillian had heard before, from lawyers, from the man who'd taken her father's land. A young, unmarried girl living under his roof. People talk about a thing like that, Lillian. People wonder. A man his age, a girl yours. No chaperone, but a doddering aunt. "Get off this land." Nathaniel's voice cut across the yard like a blade. He'd come out of the barn, and Margaret was behind him, and the gathering of hands. And Harlan turned to face them, with the practiced ease of a man who'd done this kind of thing before, and never once lost. "Mr. Hayes, I presume." Harlan tipped his hat. "I'm Harlan Brooks, Lillian's uncle. Her legal guardian, you might say, her only living kin. And I confess I'm troubled, deeply troubled, to find my poor niece living unmarried in the house of a wealthy bachelor with no one to look out for her interests or her reputation." He shook his head sorrowfully. "Now I'm a reasonable man. I'd hate to see this become a matter for the territorial courts or for the newspapers. A scandal like this, it'd follow a man of your standing for years. Ruin a girl's good name forever." He spread his hands, smiling the smile Lillian knew so well, the smile that came right before the knife. "But I'm sure we can settle it quiet, between family, for a reasonable consideration." The yard went silent. Lillian understood all at once, with a clarity that made her dizzy. He hadn't come for her. He'd never once cared whether she lived or died. He'd come because he'd learned where she'd landed, and he'd seen an opportunity, and he meant to use her reputation, her shame. The simple fact of her existence under this roof to extort money from the man who'd shown her kindness. She was being used as a weapon against the only person who'd ever chosen her. "You came here," Lillian said, and her voice shook with something that was no longer fear, "to threaten this good man's name. Using me. Using what you did to me. You abandoned me, and now you'd profit from somebody else having the decency to pick me up." "I came to protect my niece's virtue," Harlan said smoothly. "You wouldn't know virtue if it bit you, Lillian." Nathaniel's voice was very low and very controlled, the most dangerous she'd ever heard it. He came to stand beside her, and he did not touch her, but his presence was a wall at her shoulder. "Go on inside with my aunt. Let me handle this." "No." She didn't move. "He's here because of me. I'll not hide behind you." "How much?" Nathaniel said to Harlan flat. "Now you're being sensible. Shall we say, I asked how much you think a man's good name is worth, Brooks." Nathaniel's eyes were chips of flint. "Because I want you to say a number out loud in front of all these witnesses so every soul here understands exactly what you are. Go on. Name your price for not slandering me with a lie." Harlan hesitated. He'd expected fear or shame or quiet negotiation. He had not expected to be invited to incriminate himself in front of a dozen people. "That's what I thought," Nathaniel said. "You only know how to do this in the dark." He took one step forward, and Harlan took one step back. "Here's what's true, Brooks, and what every man here will swear to. Lillian Brooks works for me, for honest wage. She lives in a locked room my aunt keeps in my aunt's care, and she has never once been alone with me in any way that would shame a Sunday sermon. There is no scandal. There is a girl you threw in the dirt who got back up without your help, and that shames you, and you can't abide it, so you've come to turn her rescue into your payday. You can't prove—" "I don't have to prove a thing. You do. You want to take this to a territorial court. Do it. Bring your lawyer. Nathaniel's voice dropped lower still. And when you do, I'll bring the auctioneer at Caldwell, and the old man with the rake, and every soul who watched you sell a dead man's horses and abandon a 19-year-old girl with nowhere to sleep. Let's see whose name comes out Blackened Brooks. Let's let a judge decide who the villain is in this story. I'll spend every dollar I have to make sure it's you. Harlan's face had gone gray. You're bluffing. Try me. Nathaniel smiled, and it was not a kind smile. I've got more money than God and a powerful dislike of men who hurt the helpless. You picked the wrong ranch to extort Brooks. Now get back in your wagon and take your wife, and if I ever see either of you on this land again, I'll have you arrested for trespass and let the law sort out your character at its leisure. For a long, taut moment, Harlan Brooks weighed at the bluff, the witnesses, the certainty in the rich man's eyes, and found he did not have the stomach for the gamble. He climbed back into his wagon. Edith, her sweet mask cracked into pure venom, climbed up beside him. But Harlan could not leave without one last cut. He never could. He turned in his seat and looked at Lillian, and his voice came soft and poisonous, pitched just for her. You think this is your home? He laughed low and ugly. You're a hired girl who gentles horses, Lillian. The minute you stop being useful to him, the minute you cost him more than you're worth, you'll be sitting in the dirt again. You know it's true. It's always been true. Nobody keeps you, girl. Nobody ever has, and nobody ever will. There's something in you that the world just sets down by the side of the road. He drove away. And the cruel thing, the unbearable thing was that his words found the exact place where Lillian already lived in terror and watered the seed that Briggs had planted, and that the dead mares had fed until it grew in the space of a heartbeat, into a certainty she could not argue down. She stood in the yard long after the wagon was gone. Nathaniel was speaking to her. She could hear his voice warm and angry on her behalf, telling her none of it was true, telling her she belonged here, but the words couldn't reach her past the roaring in her ears. Nobody keeps you. The minute you cost him more than you're worth. The dead mares, the cut fence, the poisoned water. Thornton's eyes drifting to her in the corral. A man with a whole ranch to protect has a great many soft spots. The whispers in the bunkhouse. Your bad luck, girl. And now her own blood arriving to turn her into a knife at Nathaniel's throat. Everywhere she landed, ruin followed. Everyone who kept her paid. Lillian. Nathaniel's hand was almost on her arm, not quite touching the way he never quite touched, always leaving her the room to choose. Look at me. Not one word that man said is true. You hear me? Not one word. She looked at him, and she made herself smile, and the smile was the most frightening thing Margaret Hayes had ever seen, because it was calm, and it was gentle, and it was the smile of someone who had already decided something terrible. I know, Lillian said softly. I know none of it's true. It was a lie, the first lie she'd ever told him. You believe me. I believe you, Nathaniel. She did touch him, then just laid her hand briefly over his, the first time she'd ever reached for him, instead of the other way around, and his breath caught at it. Thank you. For standing up for me. No one's ever done that, not once in my whole life. I won't forget it. It sounded like gratitude. It was a goodbye. That night, Lillian Brooks lay in her narrow bed and listened to the great house settle into sleep. And she did not sleep. And somewhere past midnight, she rose in the dark and lit no lamp. She packed her canvas bag the way she'd packed it the morning of the auction. 2 dresses, her mother's Bible, her father's knife, the daguerreotype, and the wage she'd earned and never spent every coin of it because she'd never quite believed she'd be allowed to keep any of this long enough to need money. She sat at the small desk and she wrote by moonlight in her careful hand the hardest words she had ever set to paper, and her tears smeared the ink and she did not stop. Then she crept down the stairs of the sleeping house past the kitchen where Margaret's bread rose under its cloth, past the door of the man who had refused to be the 41st person to walk away from her. She went out to the corral first. The gray stallion came to her in the dark without hesitation, now pressed his great head against her chest, and she held his face in both her hands, and pressed her forehead to his, and wept without a sound. "You taught yourself to trust me," she whispered. "And now I'm doing the very thing you were always afraid I'd do. I'm leaving. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, but it's the only way to keep them safe. You'll understand that someday. You of all creatures, you'll understand keeping your distance to keep from getting hurt." She kissed the white star on his forehead. He whickered low, confused, and tried to follow her as she let herself out of the corral, pressing against the rails, and the sound of it nearly broke her resolve entirely. She did not look back. She knew if she looked back, she would never leave. And so, for the second time in 4 months, in the deepest dark before dawn, Lillian Brooks walked away from the only place that had ever felt like home. Except this time, no one had abandoned her. This time, she did the leaving. Margaret Hayes found the note at 5:30 propped against the breadcloth where she could not miss it. She read it standing in the cold kitchen, and then she sat down hard in a chair, and then she did something she had not done in 11 years. She wept. "You gave me dignity when the world had taken everything from me. You stood up for me when no one ever had. That is why I won't let my past destroy your future. Thornton wants this ranch, and he learned the way to break Nathaniel is to break what he cares for, and somehow I became one of those things. The mares died because of me. The fences were cut because of me. And now my own blood has come to use my name as a weapon against the kindest man I've ever known. As long as I'm here, the danger has a target. Take that target away, and maybe Thornton loses his hold. Tell Nathaniel I'll carry what he did for me to the end of my days. Tell the Gray I'm sorry. Tell Tobias to keep at his letters. I'm not being abandoned this time, Margaret. This time I'm the one choosing to go, and I'm choosing it because I love this place too much to watch it burn for my sake. Lillian." Margaret was still holding the note when Nathaniel came down, and she did not need to say a word. He saw her face. He saw the paper. He took it from her hands and read it once, and the color drained out of him, and then he read it again, as though the second reading might change what the first had told him. "When?" he said. "I don't know. The bread's barely risen. Hours, maybe, not more than—" He was already moving. He was out the door and across the yard in his shirt sleeves, shouting for Cole, for the hands, for anyone, and the ranch came awake in a scramble of lanterns and confusion. "Saddle every horse that can run." Nathaniel's voice cracked across the dark yard. "She's on foot. She can't have got far. Cole, take 3 men and ride the north road toward town. Wesley, the river crossing. Briggs." He caught the thick-necked hand by the collar, and his voice went murderous. "You said she was bad luck. You stood in my yard and called that girl bad luck. Well, your bad luck just walked off into the dark alone with everything she owns, and if anything's happened to her, I'll lay it at your feet. Now get on a horse and help me find her, and you'd best pray we find her safe." Briggs went white and ran for the barn. Nathaniel threw a saddle on the fastest horse he owned, and was halfway up when Margaret caught the bridle. "The auction yard," she said. He stared at her. "Think, Nathaniel. Where does a creature go when it's wounded? It goes back to where the wound was made. She'll have gone toward Caldwell, toward the place it all started. I'd stake my life on it." Margaret's hand tightened on the leather. "Find her. And when you find her, you listen before you talk. That girl spent her whole life being told what's to become of her. You don't ride up and tell her she's wrong. You ask her to stay. There's a world of difference, and she'll know it if you don't. I know the difference." He gathered the reins. "I learned it from her." He rode out into the last of the dark, and he rode hard, and he prayed to a God he wasn't always sure he believed in, that an old woman's instinct was right, and that he wasn't already too late. Lillian had been walking since 2 in the morning. She'd kept off the main road at first, cutting across open country in the dark, until the cold and the rough ground drove her back to the wagon track. Her good boots, her only boots, had worn a blister into her heel by the 3rd mile, and she'd long since stopped feeling her fingers. The canvas bag dragged at her shoulder. She'd packed it too heavy. She always packed it too heavy, as if the weight of 2 dresses and a dead man's knife could anchor her to a world that kept setting her loose. She didn't have a plan past Caldwell. That was the truth she kept circling and refusing to look at. She had her wages and her bag, and the open road the same as 4 months ago. Except 4 months ago she'd had no idea what she was losing, because she'd never had it. Now she knew exactly. Now she'd held it in her hands. The warm kitchen, the gray stallion's trust, old Wesley's wet eyes, Margaret's gruff care, and the man who never quite touched her because he always left her the choice. She'd had all of it. And she'd walked away from it in the dark, and the knowing made every mile heavier than the last. It's the right thing, she told herself for the 100th time. The mares are dead because of you. The fences. Thornton's eyes in the corral. Harlan at the gate. You're the soft spot. Take the soft spot away. But somewhere past the 4th mile in the gray light before sunrise, a different voice had begun to answer back. A quieter one. A voice that sounded, she realized with a jolt, like her father's. Is it the right thing, Lily girl? Or is it just the thing you know how to do? She stopped walking. You've been left so many times you've learned to leave first. That's all this is. You'd rather walk away than stand and watch it get taken, because the leaving feels like choosing, and the losing feels like dying. But running's not the same as protecting, girl. You taught a frightened horse that staying could be safe. When did you forget the lesson you were teaching? Stop it, Lillian whispered to the empty dawn. Stop it, Papa. But she couldn't stop it because it was true, and she sank down at the side of the road and put her face in her hands, and for the first time let herself feel the full size of what she'd done, not nobly, not as a sacrifice, but as a frightened girl who'd done the only thing she knew how to do when something hurt too much to risk. She'd run, same as Harlan said she would, same as she always did. And the worst of it was, this, she'd told Nathaniel she believed him, and she'd lied. He'd stood in his own yard and dismantled her uncle's cruelty piece by piece, the most love anyone had ever shown her, and she'd looked him in the eye and lied, and crept off in the dark, and left him a note. She'd done to him exactly what had been done to her. She'd vanished without giving him the chance to fight for her. She had become in her grief and her fear the thing she hated most. Lillian got to her feet. She didn't know yet what she meant to do. But she knew she had to keep moving, if only because she could not bear to sit still with what she'd just understood about herself. And so she walked on toward Caldwell as the sun came up, not running anymore exactly, but not yet able to turn around. She reached the auction yard by full morning. It was empty, of course. No auction today. The corral stood vacant, the platform broken down, the weathered bell still hanging crooked above the gate where she'd seen it last. She walked in through the unlocked gate, the same gate the old man with the rake had locked her inside 4 months ago. And she went to the overturned feed bucket where she'd sat the evening. Her uncle abandoned her and she sat down on it, and she set her bag between her feet exactly as she had before. And the terrible symmetry of it struck her so hard she could barely breathe. She was right back where she'd started. Same yard, same bucket, same bag. 4 months and an entire lifetime of feeling, and she'd circled all the way around to the exact spot where the world had thrown her away. As if Red Willow had been a dream. As if the gray stallion and the warm kitchen and the man who said, "Come home with me," had never been real at all. I did this to myself, she said aloud, to the empty yard, to the crooked bell. Nobody left me here this time. I walked back to the dirt all on my own. She didn't cry. She was past crying. She just sat hollowed out and waited for she didn't know what. She heard the hoofbeats before she saw him. Nathaniel came through the gate at a gallop and hauled his lathered horse to a stop so hard it nearly sat down, and he was off the saddle before it had fully halted. And then he stood there 20 feet away, chest heaving, looking at her sitting on that bucket beside that bag in that yard. And for a moment, neither of them could speak at all. Margaret was right, he finally managed. She said you'd come back here. The place it started. Lillian didn't get up. You shouldn't have come, Nathaniel. Shouldn't have. He took a step toward her, then stopped himself, the old habit leaving her the room. Lillian. You walked off into the dark, alone, with no plan and no protection, and a snake like Thornton crawling around this country. Do you have any idea? His voice broke. He got it back under control. Of course I came. What kind of man do you think I am? A good one. Her eyes filled despite everything. That's the whole problem. You're a good man, and good men get destroyed protecting the things they care about, and I made myself into one of those things, and I won't be the reason your whole life burns down. The mares died because of me, Nathaniel. Thornton noticed me in your corral. Harlan came to use me against you. Everywhere I land, ruin follows, and the only way to stop it is to run. He said it flatly. To do the one thing you've decided is the only thing you're good for. Disappearing before anybody can throw you away. So you throw yourself away first and call it noble. She flinched as if he'd struck her because it was word for word what her father's voice had told her on the road. That's not fair. No, it's not fair. None of it's fair. It wasn't fair when your kin sold your daddy's horses, and it wasn't fair when they came back to wring money out of your shame, and it sure as hell isn't fair that some rich devil poisoned my mares to scare me. Nathaniel's voice rose raw, the careful control finally cracking. But you want to know what's also not fair. Lillian? You sitting in this yard deciding all by yourself that you're a curse on the people who love you. Deciding it without asking a single one of us. You read everybody's mind, and elected yourself the problem, and slipped out in the dark, and you never once let any of us have a say in whether we wanted to keep you. Keeping me costs too much. Costs too much. He laughed, and there was no humor in it, only pain. You think I weighed it? You think I sat up nights with a ledger, tallying your worth against the price of those mares? My God, Lillian, is that what you believe love is? A sum that comes out wrong. The word hung in the empty yard. Love. He hadn't meant to say it. She saw that he hadn't. It had come out of the broken place ahead of his caution, and now it sat between them in the morning light, and neither of them could pretend it hadn't. Don't, Lillian whispered. Don't say that. You can't say that. People who say that to me, they always leave, or they always make me leave, or they sell my father's horses. The word doesn't mean what you think it means. Not to me. To me it means the thing that comes right before they let go. And there it was. The whole wound laid bare in a single sentence, and Nathaniel Hayes finally understood what he was up against. Not Thornton, not Harlan, not even the dead mares. He was up against 19 years of every single person teaching this girl that love was the name you called a thing right before you abandoned it. He crossed the rest of the distance between them. He knelt down in the dirt of the auction yard so that he was below her, looking up the way you approach a creature that has learned to expect the raised hand. Then let me show you a different meaning, he said quietly. Nathaniel, you taught a horse who'd been sold 4 times that one person in the world wasn't going to hurt him. You stood in that pen 11 mornings and never once raised your hand until that animal decided all on his own that you were safe. 11 mornings, Lillian. You didn't ask him to trust you. You just kept showing up until he believed it. Nathaniel's voice was rough with everything he was feeling. Well, I aim to do the same for you. I'll show up, every morning, for as long as it takes. I'll keep showing up until the part of you that's braced for me to let go finally understands I'm not going to. That's what I came to say. Not to argue you out of it, just to start showing up. Lillian's composure shattered. She'd held it through the auction, through Harlan, through the dead mares, through the long, dark walk. She'd held it her whole life, the careful blankness she pulled over her face so the world couldn't see where it had hurt her. And it shattered now, in a broken yard, in front of a kneeling man all at once and completely. I left you a note, she sobbed. I did to you what they did to me. I vanished in the dark. I'm no better than Harlan. I'm exactly the same. I run. I always run. You're nothing like Harlan. Nathaniel reached up slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and took her hands in both of his. She didn't pull away. Harlan left to be rid of you. You left to save us. Those aren't the same thing, Lillian. They will never be the same thing. One's cruelty and one's love wearing the only coat it owns. I know the difference. I've made a study of it the last 4 months watching you. It's the wrong kind of love, she wept. The kind that runs. Then we'll teach it to stay. He pressed her hands between his. Same as you taught the gray. You think I don't know about running? I told you the day my father died, 3 men offered to buy me out, and I wanted to run so bad I was sick behind the barn. But I stayed. I stayed, and I made every mistake, and I stayed anyway. And it became the thing I'm proudest of in my whole life. Staying. I'm asking you to be brave the way I had to be brave. I'm asking you to stay, even though everything in you is screaming to run, not for me, for yourself. Because you deserve a home you don't flee from at the first sign of fear. Lillian looked down at this man kneeling in the dirt, holding her hands. This man who had ridden through the dark to find her in the very place the world had discarded her, and something 19 years in the making began slowly, painfully to give way. What if I cost you everything? She whispered. What if Thornton wins? What if you lose the ranch because of me? Then I'll lose the ranch. He said it simply without hesitation, and she realized he meant it. It's land, Lillian. It's grass and timber and cattle. My father built it, and I love it, but it's a thing, and things can be lost and built again. You, his voice caught. You're not a thing. There's only one of you in the whole world, and I found you sitting in this exact yard 4 months ago, and I've been thanking God for it ever since. I would trade every acre I own to keep you from sitting in this dirt one more time. That's not me weighing your worth against the ranch. That's me telling you there's no comparison. There never was. It was the most anyone had ever said to her. It was more than her father had had the words for. And Lillian Brooks, who had spent her whole life braced for the moment everyone let go, sat in the broken auction yard, and finally let herself believe, not all at once, not entirely, but enough that one person in the world might actually mean to hold on. Home was never the ranch, Nathaniel said softly, still holding her hands, still kneeling beneath the crooked bell. I figured that out somewhere on the road this morning, riding hell for leather to find you. Home stopped being the ranch the day you walked into it. Home became wherever you are, Lillian. So if you won't come back to Red Willow, if you truly believe you have to go, then tell me where and I'll sell the place tomorrow and come with you. Because I'm not letting go. I came here to tell you that. I'm done watching the people I love get left in the dirt, starting with you, starting right now. For a long moment, Lillian couldn't speak. Then she slid off the bucket and onto her knees in the dirt beside him, so they were level, so she was no longer above him, and she put her arms around his neck and pressed her wet face into his shoulder and held on the way. She'd never once let herself hold on to anything, because holding on meant having it taken, and she'd spent her whole life refusing to give the world that satisfaction. I don't want you to sell the ranch, she said into his collar. I want to go home. I want to go back to the gray and to Margaret and to Wesley and to Tobias's letters. I want... Her voice broke entirely. I want to stop running, Nathaniel. I'm so tired of running. I don't know how to stay. Nobody ever taught me. Will you teach me how to stay? Every morning. He held her like something precious, like something that had nearly been lost. For the rest of my life, if you'll let me. We'll teach each other. They knelt there together in the dirt of the auction yard, the place where her life had nearly ended, and Lillian wept 4 months and 19 years of held-back grief into the shoulder of a man who had come back for her, who had ridden through the dark, who had refused finally completely to be one of the people who let her go. They rode back to Red Willow together, Lillian behind him on the lathered horse with her arms around his waist and her cheek against his back, and her canvas bag tied behind the saddle. And she did not look back at the auction yard, because for the first time in her life, she had no need to. The wound was behind her. She was riding toward the place that had become her home of her own choosing, awake and willing, and that made all the difference in the world. They met Cole and 2 hands on the North Road, and Wesley at the river crossing. And the relief on those weathered faces when they saw her safe told Lillian a thing she had not let herself believe, that she had been missed. That grown men had ridden out into the dark, frightened for her sake. That she was to these people worth searching for. She wept again a little at that. She was learning that being loved would do that to a person who'd had so little practice at it. Margaret was on the porch when they rode up, and she came down the steps faster than a woman her age had any business moving. And she pulled Lillian off that horse, and into an embrace so fierce it drove the breath out of her. And then she held the girl at arm's length and looked her hard in the face. "Don't you ever," Margaret said, and her voice shook. "Don't you ever do that to us again, Lillian Brooks. Do you hear me? You don't get to decide all by yourself that you're a burden and slip off in the night. You're family now. Family argues things out at the kitchen table. Family doesn't leave notes." Then her sternness collapsed, and she pulled the girl back into her arms. "We were so frightened. I was so frightened. You foolish, brave, foolish child." "I'm sorry," Lillian whispered. "I'm sorry, Margaret. I won't run again. I promise. Even when I'm scared. Especially when I'm scared. See that you don't." Margaret pulled back, wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, and recovered her composure, with the speed of a woman who'd spent 60 years not letting anyone see her cry. "Now get inside. You've been walking all night, you're white as flour, and I'll not have you fainting in the yard for all the hands to gossip over. There's stew." "There's always stew," Lillian said, and laughed wet and broken and real. "And there always will be," Margaret said firmly, "as long as I draw breath and you've a place at this table, which is forever. Inside. Now." But before Lillian could go in, the gray stallion screamed from the corral. He'd heard her voice or caught her scent on the morning air, and he was throwing himself against the rails in a frenzy of need. And Lillian broke from Margaret's arms and ran to him, and he dropped his great head over the top rail and pressed his face against her chest and trembled, and she wrapped her arms around his neck and held him and felt his heart slamming against her own. "I came back," she told him, the way she'd told no one but him the truth that night. "I told you I was leaving, and I'm so sorry, but I came back. I'm learning to stay. You taught me half of it, and Nathaniel taught me the rest. I came back, and I'm not going anywhere, not ever again." The stallion shuddered once all over, and then went still in her arms, and let out a long breath against her shoulder, and the trust came back into him all at once, the way it never does for horses who've been betrayed, except this once. For this girl, because some bonds are stronger than the fear that tries to break them. Nathaniel watched the two of them, the broken horse and the broken girl who were teaching each other to be whole, and Margaret came to stand beside him, and neither of them spoke for a while. "You said it, didn't you?" Margaret said quietly. "Out there. You told her." "Told her what?" "Don't be a fool with me, Nathaniel." He was quiet a moment. "It came out. I didn't plan it. It just came out in the worst possible spot, kneeling in the dirt with her, telling me love was the word people said right before they left her." He shook his head slowly. "Hell of a place to say it for the first time." "It was exactly the right place," Margaret said. "It was the one place in the whole world she needed to hear it. You said the word love to her standing in the yard, where her own blood proved it meant nothing, and you made it mean something else. You don't see what you did, do you? You changed the meaning of a word for her. There's not a finer thing a person can do for another soul." Nathaniel watched Lillian, her arms around the stallion's neck, the morning sun on her hair, home at last, and choosing to stay. "I'd change every word in the language for her," he said quietly, "if it'd keep her from ever sitting in that dirt again." But even as he said it, even in that golden hour of grief turned to homecoming, with the girl safe, and the horse calmed, and the family whole. Neither Nathaniel, nor Margaret, nor Lillian knew that a rider had stopped at the foot of the ranch road an hour before, watched the search parties scatter in the dark, watched the rich man ride out frantic after a runaway girl, and turned his horse back toward the south to report what he'd seen. By that afternoon, in a paneled office 200 miles away, Silas Thornton would lean back in his chair, lace his fingers across his vest, and smile the smile of a man who has just discovered the exact location of his enemy's heart. "So," he would say softly to the rider who'd brought him the news, "the cattle baron rode through the dark like a madman to fetch back a hired girl. Sold mares didn't move him, cut fence didn't move him, but the girl—" His smile widened. "The girl moves him. Well, well. We've been burning his barns when we should have been threatening his heart." He reached for a pen. "Find out everything there is to know about Miss Lillian Brooks, her people, her past, every shameful thing her family ever did." The pen scratched across paper. A man will sign away an empire to protect the one thing he can't replace. We just had to learn what it was. And far to the north, unknowing Lillian Brooks stood in the morning sun with her arms around a horse that had learned to trust again, finally fully home, and entirely unaware that her homecoming had just made her the most dangerous thing she could possibly be. A target worth more than the ranch itself. The break came from the last place anyone expected. It came from Briggs. 3 days after Lillian's homecoming, the thick-necked hand who'd called her bad luck in the yard came to the house at dusk, turning his hat in his hands, unable to meet anyone's eye. Margaret nearly turned him away. Nathaniel almost did. But Lillian, who knew the look of a man carrying something too heavy to hold, said quietly, "Let him speak." "I got to tell you something," Briggs said, "and after I tell it, you'll likely run me off this place and I'll deserve it." He swallowed hard. "The night the mares died, I was on watch, and I left my post. For 2 hours. There was a man waiting at the river crossing with $40 and a bottle, and he said all I had to do was look the other way and forget I ever saw anybody come up from the south pasture." The kitchen went dead silent. "You let him in," Nathaniel said very low. "You let the man in who poisoned my mares. I didn't know what he meant to do, I swear it before God. I thought maybe he meant to cut some fence, run off some stock. I needed the money, my mother's sick down in Cheyenne, and the doctor wants paying, and $40 is 2 months' wage." Briggs's voice cracked. "I never dreamed he'd kill anything. And then the mares died screaming, and I knew what I'd done, and I couldn't live with it. And when Miss Lillian stood there and took the blame I'd earned when I watched her get called bad luck for a thing I let happen." He finally looked up, and his eyes were wet. "I can't carry it anymore. I'll go to the law. I'll swear out whatever you want. I just couldn't let her keep paying for what I did." For a long moment no one breathed. Then Lillian crossed the kitchen and stood in front of the man who'd called her a curse, and Briggs flinched as though she might strike him. "The man at the river," she said steadily. "Describe him." "Lean, city clothes but rough hands, like a man who used to work and got soft. Scar through one eyebrow. He talked slow and careful, like a fellow who said the same speech 100 times. Briggs shook his head. "And he had a paper. A folded paper he kept padding in his breast pocket like it mattered more than the money. I saw it when he reached for the bottle." "A paper?" Nathaniel's eyes sharpened. "What kind of paper?" "Couldn't say. Folded thick, heavy stock like a legal thing. He caught me looking and tucked it away fast." And that, more than the confession, more than the $40, was the thread Lillian seized, because she had spent 6 months keeping her father's records, and 2 years of feed ledgers had taught her that men who carry papers carry them for a reason. "Nathaniel," she said slowly, "Thornton's been buying up the whole North Valley, the Caldwells, the Mercers, old Pratt. You said it yourself the first day he came." She was thinking fast now, the way she did over a tangled ledger. "How does a man buy up a dozen ranches that fast? Where does the money come from? And every one of those sellers they sold cheap after trouble. Burned barns, cut fence, poisoned wells." She looked up. What if the trouble isn't just to scare people into selling? What if Thornton needs them to sell cheap because the money isn't really his? What if he's promised that rail company a finished valley? He doesn't have the funds to buy honest. "You're saying he's overextended." "I'm saying a man who poisons horses to drop a price is a man who can't afford the real price." Her mind was racing. And a man stretched that thin keeps records. He has to. Investors, promised deeds, loans against land he doesn't own yet. The paper in that man's pocket, Nathaniel, that paper is part of a trail. Thornton's whole scheme runs on documents the same as my father's ranch ran on documents the same as Harlan stole what he stole with a lawyer and papers. You don't fight a man like that with fists. You fight him with his own ledgers. Nathaniel looked at her, and something kindled in his face. Not just love now, but the dawning recognition of exactly what kind of partner he'd nearly lost in the dark. "Then we need that paper," he said. "We need all of them," Lillian corrected. "And I think I know how to start finding them." She started with the Caldwells. The family that had held out, whose barn had burned, who'd sold the next week for half price. They'd moved to a hardscrabble place 40 miles east. And Lillian and Nathaniel rode out to find them. And Lillian sat at their poor table and did the thing she did best. She listened. She let an embittered woman talk. They had us before we ever signed. Mrs. Caldwell said, her hands twisting in her apron. Thornton's man came with the contract already drawn, said sign here, take the money, be grateful. And we were so beaten down, the barn gone, the well fouled, my husband sick with the worry of it, we signed. We never read it close. Who reads close when the wolf's at the door? Do you have your copy? Lillian asked gently. The contract. Did they leave you one? Somewhere. Mrs. Caldwell frowned. In the trunk, I think. Why would you want that? Because I'd like to read it close, Lillian said. The way nobody had the chance to that night. She read it that evening by lamplight, and what she found made her go very still. Nathaniel. She set the contract down with great care. This deed transfers the Caldwell land not to the Western Territories Development Company. It transfers it to a man named Silas Thornton personally, as an individual. She tapped the page. But when he came to your porch, he said he was buying for the company. He stood in your yard and said, my company is assembling the valley. He's not buying it for any company. He's buying it for himself in his own name and telling everyone, telling his investors, telling the rail people that the company holds it. He's stealing from his own backers. He's stealing from everyone. Lillian's eyes were bright now, the way they got over a problem coming clear. He takes investors' money, says he'll assemble the valley for the company. Then he buys the land cheap because he terrorizes people into selling in his own name pockets. The difference between what investors think he paid and what he actually paid, and plans to sell the whole valley to the railroad himself and keep the profit. The trouble he causes isn't just to force sales. The lower the price, the more he skims. She sat back. It's a fraud stacked on a fraud, Nathaniel. And every dollar of it lives in documents. Contracts that say one thing to investors and another to sellers. He cannot have one set of papers. He has to have two. And if we find both sets, we don't just save your ranch, we hang him. She said it flatly, a woman who'd been thrown in the dirt and was done being gentle about who deserved what. Every family he frightened off their land gets it back or gets paid honest for it. And no judge in the territory could look at two contradicting deeds in the same man's hand and call it anything but what it is. But finding the second set of records meant getting inside Thornton's operation, and that was where the danger turned sharp. It was Tobias of all people who provided the way, and Tobias the stable boy, 14 years old, whom Lillian had taught his letters by lamplight. Because a man came through Caldwell looking to hire a boy who could read and write a fair hand to copy documents for a land company office in the territorial capital. And Tobias overheard it in town, and Tobias came running home with the news. I could do it, he said breathlessly. I could get hired on. I read good now, Miss Lillian, you taught me. I could get into the office and find the papers and... No. Lillian and Nathaniel said it at the same instant. Absolutely not. Lillian went on, kneeling to take the boy by the shoulders. Tobias, listen to me. The man who runs that office poisoned 4 horses to scare a grown man into selling his land. He will not blink at hurting a boy who crosses him. You are not going into that office. Do you hear me? But you taught me my letters so I'd never be at another man's mercy. And I meant it. But there's a difference between not being at a man's mercy and walking straight into his den. She softened. You did a brave thing bringing us this. The bravest. But the bravest thing of all is knowing when a fight's too big to take alone. We'll find another way in. The other way in was Nathaniel's money and Nathaniel's name, and a lawyer in the territorial capital named Asa Whitfield, who'd known Nathaniel's father and owed the Hayes family more than one favor. Silas Thornton, Whitfield said when Nathaniel laid it out across his desk. I know the name. He's been raising money all over the territory for this valley scheme of his. Respectable men have put their savings into it. He steepled his fingers. If what your Miss Brooks suspects is true, 2 sets of deeds money skimmed sellers terrorized, Then he's committed fraud extortion, and now if your man Briggs will testify conspiracy to destroy property and very possibly attempted murder given strychnine in a feed bin." Whitfield's old eyes glinted. "But suspecting is not proving. We need the documents, and those will be locked in his office or his bank behind men he pays to keep them locked. Then we get a court to open them," Lillian said. She'd come to the capital with Nathaniel. She would not be left at the ranch for this. "Don't we? If Briggs swears out a statement that a man hired him to let in whoever poisoned the mares and the Caldwell contract, proves Thornton bought in his own name while claiming to buy for the company, that's enough for a judge to compel the records, isn't it?" Whitfield looked at the young woman who'd just laid out the legal strategy faster than half the clerks he employed, and then he looked at Nathaniel and a slow smile crossed his face. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "wherever did you find her?" "Auction yard," Nathaniel said, and there was no mistaking the pride in it. "Sitting in the dirt. Best day of my life, the day I walked over." Thornton struck first. He always did. He was a man who understood that the side which moves first chooses the ground. Word reached Red Willow through a sympathetic clerk in Whitfield's building that Silas Thornton had filed papers of his own, a petition before the territorial court, alleging that Nathaniel Hayes was unlawfully harboring a young woman, one Lillian Brooks, against the wishes of her lawful guardian and Uncle Harlan Brooks, and that the said Hayes had used his wealth and influence to corrupt and exploit a vulnerable orphaned girl. Harlan. Of course it was Harlan. Thornton had found him, or Harlan had found Thornton, two men who turned other people's helplessness into profit, recognizing each other across the territory like wolves catching a familiar scent. "He's using me," Lillian said white-lipped when Whitfield read out the petition. "Again, he's making me the weapon again. If they can paint me as some ruined girl Nathaniel exploited, then everything we say about Thornton looks like the desperate lies of a man trying to cover his own sins," Whitfield finished grimly. "Yes, it's clever. He's poisoning the well before we ever get to testify. If the court sees you as a victim of Hayes, then Hayes's accusations against Thornton become the slander of a guilty man. He's turning your good name into the lever that breaks our whole case." The old Lillian would have run. The girl who walked out into the dark 4 months ago would have looked at this. Her shame weaponized her presence, endangering the man she loved. Her very existence, the crack through which their enemies meant to break them. And she would have packed her canvas bag and vanished, certain to the bone that she was the curse, the soft spot, the thing best removed. She did not run. She stood up in Whitfield's office, and her face had gone hard and clear, and Nathaniel watched her become in that moment something he'd only glimpsed before. "No," she said. "He thinks my shame is his weapon. He's wrong. He's about to learn just how wrong." She turned to Whitfield. "He wants a court to hear about Lillian Brooks, the exploited orphan. Then let's give the court Lillian Brooks. Let me testify. Let me stand up in front of that judge and tell them in my own words exactly what was done to me and by whom. Harlan sold my father's horses and left me in an auction yard. That's a matter of record. You said yourself there are witnesses, the auctioneer, the old man with the rake. Nathaniel offered me honest work and a locked door and his aunt's protection. That's the truth, and the truth has the advantage of being provable." Her voice rang in the small office. "They want to put my past on trial. Fine. I'll put theirs on trial right back. And I'll bring the Caldwell contract and Briggs's statement and every record I can lay hands on, and we'll see whose story stands when it's all in the open." Whitfield stared at her. Then he began slowly to smile. "Mr. Hayes," he said again softly. "Auction yard, you say?" "Best day of my life," Nathaniel repeated quietly, looking at her. The hearing was set, and Whitfield, armed with Briggs's sworn statement and the Caldwell deed, persuaded the judge to compel an examination of Thornton's land transactions. And here the whole thing turned on a knife's edge, because Thornton, the night before the records were due to be produced, made his last and most desperate move. He came to Red Willow himself, not in his fine black buggy this time. He came at dusk alone on horseback, and he was led into the parlor because Nathaniel wanted witnesses, and he sat across from Nathaniel and Lillian and Margaret, with the easy smile of a man holding what he believed was a winning hand. "I'll be direct," Thornton said, "because I respect a fair fight, and you've put up a better one than I expected. Especially you, Miss Brooks. I confess I underestimated you. I thought you were Hayes's weakness. I'm beginning to think you might be his strength." He inclined his head, almost a compliment. "Which is precisely why I'm here. I'm prepared to withdraw the petition. Tell Harlan Brooks to crawl back under his rock. Make the whole ugly business of your guardianship disappear as if it never happened. Your name stays clean, Miss Brooks. Spotless. No court, no scandal, no whispers." "In exchange for what?" Nathaniel said. "In exchange for Red Willow." Thornton spread his hands. "Sell me the ranch at the price I first offered, which is more than fair, more than generous, and drop these wild accusations about deeds and skimming and whatever else this clever girl's dreamed up. You walk away rich. Your people keep their dignity. Miss Brooks keeps her good name." His smile sharpened. "Or we go to court. And in court, Mr. Hayes, I will make certain that the world remembers Lillian Brooks not as a wronged orphan, but as the kept woman of a wealthy rancher, a girl with no people, no virtue, and no defense. I'll drag her through every paper in the territory. By the time I'm done, she won't be able to walk into a church in Wyoming without women pulling their skirts aside." He leaned forward. "I'm giving you a chance to protect her, Hayes. Don't be a fool about it. What's a ranch against a woman's good name?" It was Lillian had to admit a masterful play. He'd found the exact shape of Nathaniel's heart and built a trap around it. Sell the ranch to save her name, or keep the ranch and watch her be destroyed in open court. Either way, Thornton won. Either way, he'd correctly judged that Nathaniel Hayes would burn his empire to ash before he'd let Lillian be hurt. And 4 months ago it would have worked. 4 months ago, Lillian would have begged Nathaniel to sell to save himself the choice to spare her the shame, or she'd have vanished in the night to take the leverage away. Instead, she laughed. It startled all of them, Thornton, most of all. A clear, genuine laugh. The laugh of someone who has just watched a clever man overplay his hand. "Mr. Thornton," she said, "you've made one mistake, and it's the same mistake my uncle made, and the same mistake every soul who ever threw me away has made. You think my shame can be used against me." She stood. "But you can only shame a person who's hiding something. And I'm not hiding a single thing. You want to tell the whole territory that I was a homeless girl sold at auction by my own blood. Go ahead, it's true. You want to tell them a kind man gave me honest work and a locked door. That's true too, and I'll thank you for spreading it. There's nothing you can say about my past that I'm afraid to have said out loud, because I didn't do anything wrong. They did." Her eyes blazed. "My uncle abandoned me. You poisoned 4 horses. The shame was never mine to carry. It was always yours. And the difference between us, Mr. Thornton, is that I'll stand in that courtroom and say every word of my story to anyone who'll listen, while you'll be praying to God nobody opens your ledgers." Thornton's smile had frozen on his face. "And they will be opened," Lillian went on, stepping closer. "Tomorrow, by order of the court. 2 sets of deeds, Mr. Thornton. The ones you showed your investors, and the ones you actually filed in your own name. The Caldwell contract that proves you bought personal what you claimed to buy for the company. And Mr. Briggs, who's already sworn out a statement about the man you hired to poison this ranch, the man with the scar through his eyebrow and the folded paper in his breast pocket. You came here tonight to frighten us into a deal because you knew that once those records open, you're finished." She smiled, and it was the smile Margaret had once found so frightening, except now it was aimed where it belonged. "You didn't come to make an offer. You came because you're afraid. And you should be." The silence in the parlor was absolute. Thornton looked from Lillian to Nathaniel to Margaret, and the easy confidence drained out of him exactly as it had drained out of Harlan in the yard 4 months before. And what was left underneath was the small cold panic of a man who has just realized the ground has gone out from under him. "You're bluffing," he said, but his voice had lost its silk. "You don't have my records. You can't have. They're—" He stopped, but too late. "They're where?" Nathaniel said softly, rising to stand beside Lillian. "Go on, Thornton. Finish that sentence. Tell us where they are. You've been so careful all this time. Don't slip now. Thornton stood. He'd come to make a deal from a position of strength, and somewhere in the last 5 minutes, the strength had passed entirely to the other side of the room, and he knew it, and the knowing made him reckless. "This isn't over," he said, low and ugly. "You think a clever orphan and a stack of papers can finish me? I've got men, I've got money, I've got half the territory's officials in my pocket. You open my ledgers tomorrow, Hayes, and You'll what?" Nathaniel took a step toward him. "Burn another barn, poison another horse, go on, threaten me in my own parlor in front of my aunt and the woman I'm going to marry. Give me one more reason to make sure you hang." The word landed before Nathaniel even realized he'd said it. "The woman I'm going to marry." Lillian's breath stopped. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. And even Thornton, in the middle of his own ruin, went briefly still at the sheer force of how plainly the man had said it. Nathaniel heard it himself a half-second late, and instead of taking it back, he turned to Lillian, right there with their enemy standing between them, and he said it again, clear and unashamed. "That's right. The woman I'm going to marry. If she'll have me." His eyes never left hers. "I was going to find a better moment, a finer place than this. But I'm done waiting for fine moments, Lillian. I almost lost you to the dark once. I'm not going to keep words like these locked up against some perfect day that might never come." He took her hand. "I love you. I've loved you since you walked into a corral that no man would enter and taught a broken horse to trust again. Marry me. Not because you need saving. God knows you've saved yourself and this ranch and probably all of us. Marry me because you're the strongest, truest partner I've ever known, and I want to spend whatever years I've got standing next to you. That's all. That's the whole of it." For a long moment, Lillian could not speak. Then she looked at Thornton, at the ruined, sputtering man who'd come to weaponize her shame, and instead found himself an accidental witness to the best moment of her life. And she laughed again, bright and free. "You came here to tell me I'd never walk into a church in Wyoming," she said to him. "And instead, you're going to be the first person to hear that I'm getting married in one." She turned back to Nathaniel, and her eyes were wet and shining and certain. "Yes. Of course it's yes. It was yes the morning the gray followed me to the gate, and I let myself believe I might get to stay." She gripped his hand hard. "I'll have you, Nathaniel Hayes. I'll have you and this ranch and every fight that comes with it. I'm done running. I told you I'd learn to stay. Watch me." "Get out, Thornton," Margaret said from her chair in the voice that had ended arguments for 60 years. "You've heard a proposal you weren't invited to. Now go home and put your affairs in order. You'll want a good lawyer." Her eyes were like flint. "And you might want to ride fast. From the look on your face, you've just remembered exactly where you left your ledgers, and you're wondering whether you can reach them before the court does." Thornton bolted. He was gone before the door had finished swinging his horse, pounding down the dark road toward the south, toward the territorial capital, toward the office where 2 sets of deeds sat waiting for the morning, and Nathaniel let him go, because Whitfield's man and the territorial marshal were already watching. That office had been watching it since dusk, on the simple theory that a guilty man cornered will always run straight to the thing he's most afraid of losing. "Should we stop him?" Lillian asked. "No." Nathaniel pulled her against his side, and Margaret rose to stand with them both, the 3 of them, in the lamplit parlor. "Let him run. He'll lead the marshal right to it. He spent 4 months thinking he was hunting us." His arm tightened around her. He never once understood that the girl he marked as a weakness was the one who'd take him apart. Lillian leaned into him, this man who had ridden through the dark for her, who had refused to be the 41st person to walk away, who had just proposed marriage in the middle of a standoff because he was done saving good words for perfect days. Outside, the hoofbeats faded toward the man's own destruction. Inside, the gray stallion called once from the corral, and she would go to him soon and tell him the news the way she told him everything. But for now, she stood in the circle of a family that had chosen her in a home she had chosen. Back no longer braced for the moment it would all be taken away. "He thought my past was a weakness," she said softly, watching the dark road where their enemy had vanished. He never understood. Everything that broke me is exactly what makes me impossible to break now. There's nothing left in my past for anyone to threaten me with. I survived all of it. And a person who survived the worst the world can do. She turned her face up to Nathaniel's. That's not a soft spot, Mr. Hayes. That's a fortress. They caught Silas Thornton at his own office door at 4 a.m, on his knees in front of the iron safe with both sets of deeds spread across the floor where he'd been frantically sorting the ones he needed to burn. The territorial marshal had been waiting in the dark exactly as Nathaniel predicted. Thornton had ridden 200 miles through the night, lathered 3 horses to ruin, and led the law straight to the one thing that could hang him, just as a frightened animal runs straight back to the wound. When they put the irons on him, the careful silk had gone entirely out of his voice, and what came out instead was the high, ugly panic of a man who'd built an empire on the helplessness of others, and never once believed it could be turned against him. The 2 sets of deeds told the whole story without a word of testimony needed. One stack, shown to investors, recorded the Western Territories Development Company purchasing ranches across the North Valley at fair and generous prices. The other stack, filed quietly in the county recorder's office, showed Silas Thornton as a private individual buying those same ranches at half and a third of those prices, beaten down by burned barns and poisoned wells and cut fences. The difference, dollar for dollar, had flowed into Thornton's own pockets, skimmed from the savings of respectable men who'd trusted him to build them a railroad fortune. It was, as Lillian had said in Whitfield's office, a fraud stacked on a fraud. And it was all there in his own hand, on heavy legal stock. The trial filled the territorial courthouse past its walls. People came from 4 counties. The families Thornton had frightened off their land. The investors he'd robbed, the merchants who'd watched the North Valley fall under one man's shadow, and the simply curious who'd heard there was to be a reckoning. They packed the benches and stood along the walls and crowded the doorway, and word of it had spread so far that men who'd never met Nathaniel Hayes argued his case in saloons 200 miles away. But it was not Nathaniel they came in the end to watch. It was the girl. Lillian Brooks took the stand on the second day in a plain dark dress with her hands folded and her chin level, and she told her story to a silent courtroom in a voice that never once shook. She told them about her father, Caleb Brooks, and his gift with horses, and the fever that took him in 9 days. She told them about the debts and the bank, and the half-brother who appeared before the grave was cold with a lawyer and a claim. She told them about 6 months of free labor, and then the auction at Caldwell, and the moment her own uncle pocketed the money from her father's last 2 horses and told her she was no longer his problem. "He left me in the dirt," she said simply to the hushed room. 40 people watched, and not one of them helped, and the gate locked behind them, and I sat in that yard at sundown with $4 and my mother's Bible and absolutely nowhere in the world to go. She paused. "I tell you this, not for your pity. I've no use for pity. I tell you because the prosecution wants to paint me as some ruined girl that Mr. Hayes exploited. So I want every soul in this room to hear from my own mouth exactly what happened. A man named Silas Thornton and a man named Harlan Brooks have tried to use my hardest day as a weapon. They thought my shame would buy my silence." Her eyes swept the gallery. "But I'm not ashamed. I never did one thing wrong. I was a girl whose family threw her away, and a decent man wouldn't let it stand. That's the whole story. And if telling it plainly costs me my good name in the eyes of anyone here, then their good opinion was never worth keeping." When she stepped down, the courtroom was so quiet you could hear the clock on the wall. And then it was Lillian who laid out document by document the architecture of Thornton's fraud, because Whitfield had wisely understood that no lawyer in the territory could explain those 2 sets of deeds the way the young woman who'd first untangled them could. She walked the jury through the Caldwell contract. She showed them side by side the price Thornton told investors and the price he actually paid. She tied the burned barns and the poisoned wells to each depressed sale, a pattern as clear as columns in a ledger once someone troubled to add them up. She produced Briggs, who told the court in a breaking voice about the $40, and the man with the scarred eyebrow, and the marshal who'd traced that same scarred man to Thornton's pay, and arrested him crossing into Nebraska territory, with the folded deed still in his breast pocket. By the end of the third day, there was nothing left of Silas Thornton's empire but a man in irons and a stack of papers that condemned him in his own handwriting. The jury was gone 40 minutes. Guilty, on every count. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy, and the destruction of property that had killed 4 animals and very nearly a man's whole livelihood. The judge, a hard old territorial appointee who'd seen the valley's small families crushed one by one, handed down a sentence that made the gallery murmur and ordered every fraudulent deed, voided every terrorized family given the chance to reclaim their land or be paid its honest worth. The North Valley, which one man had nearly swallowed whole, was handed back to the people he'd stolen it from, and Harlan Brooks, who had tied his fortunes to Thornton's in hopes of a payday. Harlan, who had stood in the Red Willow yard and told his niece that nobody would ever keep her, was charged as a conspirator for his part in the false petition, and exposed in open court as the man who'd stripped a dead brother's daughter of her inheritance and abandoned her at an auction. He left the territory within the month, his name a byword for the lowest kind of kin, and Lillian never saw him again, and found somewhat to her own surprise that she didn't need to. "I thought I'd want to watch him ruined," she admitted to Nathaniel on the long ride home. "All those months I thought there'd be some satisfaction in it, but there isn't much. He's just a small, greedy man who'll be small and greedy somewhere else now." She watched the road. The satisfaction wasn't in destroying him. It was in standing up in that courtroom and not being afraid anymore. That's the thing he and Thornton never understood. They could only hold power over me as long as I was ashamed. The day I stopped being ashamed, they had nothing left. "You took them both apart," Nathaniel said quietly, "with a stack of ledgers and the truth told plain." "My father taught me the ledgers." She smiled. "You taught me the rest. You taught me to stay long enough to fight instead of running before the fight could start." They were married in the spring in the small white church in the valley town, and it was the most crowded that church had ever been. The families Thornton had terrorized came the Caldwells, the Mercers. Old Pratt, all of them, back on their reclaimed land, because the young woman who'd untangled the fraud that freed them was, they'd decided, the closest thing the valley had to a hero, and they would not have missed her wedding for anything in the world. The ranch hands came scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good clothes. Wesley wept openly through the whole ceremony and pretended afterward it was his bad hip. Tobias, 15 now, and reading anything he could get his hands on, stood up straight, as the boy who'd run 40 miles of news and helped break a fraud, and he gave the bride away because she'd asked him to. Because the boy whose letters she'd taught him had no father either, and the two of them had decided some while ago that they were family enough to stand in for the blood that had failed them both. And Margaret Hayes, who had once held a lamp up in the dark and warned a stray girl that she'd be either the fiercest friend or the fiercest enemy in the territory. Margaret sat in the front pew and watched her nephew marry the woman she now loved as her own daughter, and she did not bother this time to pretend the tears were anything but what they were. "I told you," she said to Lillian afterward, holding the girl's face in both hands. "I told you that first morning. A gift, not a grief. I knew it before you did. I knew it before my fool nephew did." She kissed her forehead. "Welcome home, daughter. For good this time." The gray stallion was there too in his way. Lillian had insisted on it. He stood in the churchyard paddock in a halter she'd braided herself. And when she came out on Nathaniel's arm, married in her plain, pretty dress, the great horse that no man could approach dropped his head over the rail and pressed his face against her chest, the way he had the morning she came home, and she laughed and wept and held his face and whispered something only he could hear. And there was not a soul in the valley who didn't understand that the broken horse and the abandoned girl had saved each other, and that some bonds run deeper than any vow. But the wedding was not the end of the story Lillian Brooks meant to write. It was, she said, only the start of the better part. Because Lillian had not forgotten the auction yard. She would never forget it. And in the months after the trial, as the valley healed and Red Willow prospered, and the name Hayes came to mean something different than it ever had before, she found she could not rest easy in her good fortune, while she knew in her bones exactly how many children, how many widows, how many cast-off and forgotten souls were sitting in their own version of that empty yard, at that very moment waiting for a wagon that would never come. "I keep thinking," she said to Nathaniel one evening, "about all the people who don't get a cowboy walking across the yard. I got lucky. One decent man happened to count the crowd and decide not to be the 41st. But luck isn't a plan, Nathaniel. Luck shouldn't be the only thing standing between a thrown-away child and ruin." She turned to him. "I want to build something, so nobody who lands here ever has to depend on luck the way I did." And so they built it. Red Willow Ranch, in the years that followed, became known across the whole of Wyoming territory for something far greater than its cattle or its acres, or even its part in breaking the man who'd tried to swallow the valley. It became known as the place that turned no one away. No orphan, no widow, no struggling family burned out or bought out or beaten down by hard country and harder luck was ever sent on from the Red Willow Gate without a meal, a bed, and the offer of honest work. Lillian ran it the way Margaret had run the household, and the way her father had gentled horses with a kindness that disguised itself as common sense, so that no proud soul would ever have to feel like charity. "It's not charity," she would say, in Margaret's own words, ladling stew. "It's supper. Sit down before you insult me." But the thing that made her name live longest, the thing they still spoke of in that valley 2 generations on, was the school. Lillian Brooks Hayes built a free horse training school for orphaned and abandoned teenagers, the very children the world had decided cost too much to keep. She gathered them from poorhouses and street corners and the doorsteps of churches, the angry ones and the broken ones, and the ones who'd already learned far too young to strike first, because close was where the pain came from. And she did with them exactly what she'd done with a gray stallion sold 4 times in 2 years. She showed up every morning. She never raised her hand. She outlasted their fear. She taught them that a frightened creature isn't a bad creature, that there's a difference between mean and hurt, and that the difference is everything. She taught them honest work and a fair wage, and how to read a contract close, so no man could ever cheat them the way her father had been cheated, the way the Caldwells had been cheated. She taught them their letters the way she'd taught Tobias, so they'd never be at another person's mercy. And above all, she taught them the lesson that had taken her own self 19 years and an empty auction yard and one stubborn cattle baron to learn. That being thrown away does not decide who you are. That the people who let go of you were measuring the wrong thing. That a soul which has survived the worst the world can do is not a weakness to be hidden, but a fortress that no one can ever breach again. Many of those children grew into the most respected horse trainers in the territory. Some came back to work Red Willow for the rest of their lives. Some built homes and families of their own and raised children who would never, not for one single day, know what it was to sit alone in the dirt and watch the last wagon roll away. And every one of them carried wherever they went the plain, hard truth that Lillian had carried out of that auction yard and spent her life turning into something that could save other people. Nobody is a burden. Some people just had the bad luck to land among those too small to see their worth. On the anniversary of the auction, the one where her life had nearly ended, Nathaniel took her back to the yard at Caldwell. It stood empty and weathered as it always did when there was no sale, the corrals bare, the platform gray with years. The broken benches were still there, and the auction bell still hung crooked above the gate, the same bell that had been the last thing she'd looked at the evening. Her uncle drove away, the same bell she'd sat beneath in despair the morning she came back to it alone. They stood beneath it together now, his hand in hers, and a great deal of country, and a great deal of living between them and the frightened girl who'd once sat on an overturned bucket with $4 and nowhere to go. "The world abandoned you here," Nathaniel said quietly, looking up at the old bell. "Sold your father's horses, locked the gate, walked away 40 strong." His hand tightened around hers. "But this is the exact spot where my whole future began. I counted that crowd, Lillian. 40 people. And I almost made it 41. I almost stood there feeling like a coward and let the wagon take me home same as the rest." He turned to her. "I think about that more than you know. How close I came to walking away. How the entire rest of my life you are home. The school, every child you've saved, all of it, hung on one decision to cross a yard instead of going home to supper. But you crossed it," Lillian said. "I crossed it." He brought her hand to his lips. "Best thing I ever did. Best thing I'll ever do." Lillian looked out past the broken gate, past the empty corrals, toward the endless gold of the summer prairie, rolling away to the edge of the sky, the same prairie she'd had no way to cross. The night she sat here ruined the same country that had felt that night, like the whole indifferent world turning its back. It looked different now. It had looked different ever since a wagon had carried her north into the dark, beside a quiet man who asked her nothing and offered her everything. "You know what I used to believe," she said. "I believed the cruelest thing about that night was being abandoned, being unwanted, sitting here while the whole world decided I wasn't worth the trouble." She shook her head slowly. "But I had it wrong. The cruelty wasn't that nobody wanted me. The cruelty was that I'd started to believe them, that I'd let 40 strangers and one wicked uncle teach me I was a thing to be set down by the side of the road. That's the real wound. Not what they did, what I let it make me think I was. And now." She turned to him. This man who had ridden through the dark, who had refused to be the 41st, who had changed the meaning of a word for her in a yard just like this one. "Now I know the truth," she said. "The greatest gift was never finding a wealthy cowboy who could rescue me from hardship. I want that written somewhere so nobody ever mistakes this story for that one. He didn't rescue me. I rescued myself. I broke the horse no one could touch. I untangled the fraud no one could see. I stood in that courtroom and refused to be ashamed." Her voice was steady and bright and absolutely certain. The greatest gift wasn't being saved by a rich man's money. It was finally, after a whole lifetime of people letting go, finding the one person who never once let go of my hand. That's all it ever takes. Not rescue, not money, not even love the way some people mean it. Just one soul who refuses to walk away. One person who counts the crowd and decides not to be the next to leave you in the dirt. She looked up at the crooked auction bell one last time, the bell that had rung over the worst day of her life, and she felt nothing but a strange and quiet gratitude, because without that day, there would have been no wagon, no gray stallion, no warm kitchen, no Margaret, no Tobias, no school, no Nathaniel, no home. The yard that had nearly ended her had it turned out been the place where everything began. "Take me home," she said. And so they rode home together across the golden summer plains, away from the place where despair had ended and hope had quietly begun, back toward the ranch where no one was ever turned away, where a gray stallion waited at the rail for the only person he'd ever trusted, where a house full of saved and stubborn children were learning that being thrown away was not the same as being worthless, back toward the life that two broken, unbreakable people had built out of nothing but a refusal to let go. Lillian Brooks had been abandoned at an auction and left without a single soul to call her own. And she had answered the cruelty of that day, not by becoming hard and not by becoming small, but by spending the rest of her life making certain that no forgotten child who landed at her gate would ever have to learn what she had learned in the dirt beneath that bell. The girl the world threw away built a home where no one is ever thrown away again. And that, in the end, was the truest victory of her life. Not that she was finally wanted, but that she became the one who made sure everyone else would be.